Thanks for joining us today on Collection Conversations. Today I'm speaking with my colleague Alex Gionfriddo. Alex, we actually started working at the library on the very same day, and I remember you telling me that one of your first projects would be working with the Australian Art and Artist Collection, which is also referred to as the AAA and Gallery Files. The work of Australian artists has always been a primary focus of the library's visual arts collection. Can you begin by telling us a little bit about the AAA collection?
Yes, so the AAA files are a collection of materials collated around particular Australian artists and also around galleries as well. So within these files, you've got things like exhibition catalogues, newspaper clippings, little bits and pieces of ephemera, even things like the artist's CV and sort of records of where the artist has exhibited and so on, and sometimes critical reaction to their art as well.
Can you tell me what period it covers?
The scope goes all the way back to the settlement of Australia by Europeans. Even one or two before that, but pretty much if you go right back to the settlement times, right up to the present day, it's still being added to nowadays.
Yeah. And what kind of size is it?
Last read it was around 30,000 files, and in terms of the physical space of those files, we're talking like really long bays of shelves, which I became very familiar with when I worked on this project. So yeah, there's a lot of material. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot more than I had imagined. 30,000 files.
Yeah.
How did you come to be working with them? What was the project?
So the project that I was specifically doing was to rehouse a lot of the older files. A number of the files weren't easily searchable on our catalogue, the State Library catalogue, which was a real problem because it's quite a well-used part of the library, but people just couldn't easily access files. So it just took people a long time to use them. So my job was to essentially rehouse the older files that hadn't been updated yet. I was putting in a nice archival folder, get it barcoded and logged onto the library cataloguing system, and also to write with particular ink that didn't fade, like long-lasting ink, which sounds strange, but it was actually really important to use this special pen, because I came across old files, you couldn't read the titles on some of the old files because the ink had faded, even living down in the basement. So yeah, to rehouse this stuff was really important so people could find the materials.
And how long did it take you to do that?
Oh, quite a while. Like I had the original contract was for a couple of months, and I got signed on a few more times, and just because of the volume of work I had to get through, I had to do a few thousands of the files. On a good day, I would probably get through 80, 90 files a day. So when you're talking about, thousands and thousands of files, it took a long time. So when I finished up, I just finished about 11 months later.
Wow.
Yeah.
I remember walking past your desk during that period, and I'd see you head down, busy at work with stacks of the files around you. What were some of your best moments working with those files?
I love working on the files because I just learned so much about art in Australia. Like I was kind of aware of, famous artists and so on beforehand, but really just to see the breadth of art in Australia just kind of fired my imagination, my appreciation for what art could be and all the different types of art, be it painting or illustration, sculpture and crafts and things. So it was such a variety of stuff. I love that. The people who I worked with, John Stevens, who was kind of managing the project, and Dominique Dunstan, who was kind of my boss, they were both really supportive and helpful with doing that kind of work too. So it was a really good team, and I got a lot out of it. Yeah.
Yeah. You kept a list, didn't you, of the artists' names that you...
I did actually, just the sake of just showing it. That's my list. I've just found that really interesting. There's so much great stuff. I just felt I had to write it down. Of the type of artists who I really liked, I had a soft spot for the naive artists. I just found that stuff really interesting in a different way to, you know, other types of art. It just seemed so kind of, there was a kind of innocence to it, I suppose, that I really enjoyed. And I also really liked the art by most of the art produced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that I came across. It's just amazing that you'd see in those catalogues that were in these files. It's beautiful. Just wow, just mind-blowing stuff, really.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a real breadth of material within the files. Did you have to overcome any particular challenges?
The things I found difficult was just the physical moving of the materials, making sure I had enough supplies for everything. I felt like I really pestered the supplies manager at State Library. It was George, who was a really nice guy, but it's like, oh, I need more files. I haven't ordered this many files for so many years. You know, we got there. It was great. But also, yeah, the physical moving of the files, I found sometimes I wanted to get as many in and out as possible. But that, you know, balancing files, walking around the whole library with a trolley, and sometimes I'd have accidents, which would be frustrating. So I tried to avoid that. I got a lot of paper cuts.
Was there something really unusual or unexpected that you came across?
Yeah. I think the most unusual thing I found was from a guy, an artist. He put in his file, there were these 2 books of cartoons, which I'm naturally drawn to anyway. But these cartoons were about people he worked with. And I think he was quite young when he did this. And, well, let me say, you just wouldn't do this nowadays. You would no way. It was just really wild and out there stuff. It was the 70s, the 60s, late 60s into the 70s. And I think a lot of the things that it gave me kind of a really interesting insight to what his profession and the way he, how people related to one another in a kind of a, well, a lot of it was quite, wasn't the most positive. So in a voyeuristic way, it was really interesting, but yeah. I'm glad I wasn't in that comic. I'm sure I would have been drawn in a particularly unflattering way.
Well, it's definitely piqued my interest. I think I'll be searching that one online on the online catalogue, thanks to your work. How about your research interest? Did you discover anything that sort of took you on a new avenue of research?
Yeah, Linda, I did. Some of the files around particular groups of artists, but also a research query on an artist called Clarice Beckett. Actually, the library's got some of her art, and she was not very well known during her lifetime, but many years later, she's now recognised as one of the great sort of Melbourne or Australian landscape painters. And so going through these files and reading about Clarice Beckett, I saw that she had links to a bunch of other Melbourne artists back in the 1920s, 30s, like Percy Leeson, Colin Colohan, and Justus Jorgensen, and especially a guy called Max Meldrum. And he kind of took my interest because he seemed like, in those days, from the 1910s till his death, he was he was probably the biggest figure in the Melbourne art scene, individual figure in the Melbourne art, and had a lot of students, and these other people, and Clarice was his student for a time, and was, I think, if you look at her art and Max Meldrum's art, there's definitely a crossing over there. He was loved and hated, and just really interesting guy. So from that, I sort of put together a blog that's on the website about all of these people. And so it was really cool looking at the AAA files, finding all this information out about the different artists, and also seeing what other materials the library had in the manuscript section. For example, I found some really revealing stuff around these artists and Clarice Beckett, as well as some of the pictures that we hold. So yeah, all good stuff. Yeah.
When I've been researching a particular artist or even an artwork, I've used the AAA files as my first port of call. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the files can be useful for that type of research.
Yeah, Linda, I totally agree, because going to the files first, I think it just sets you on your research path. It just knocks off a few things very quickly, usually around exhibitions, specifically, but also those other newspaper articles. Finding that stuff, just having it at hand and being able to read through, it's just such a valuable research tool. When you're going through and doing other types of research and using databases and websites, which can be very good way of doing things, I just find that it's not quite as immediate as just having the file that the AAA stuff does give. Within a AAA file, you're always going to know there's going to be at least one thing about the artist. If it's in the file with us, there's going to be something there. But for some artists, you're going to find a lot of material around their exhibitions or the critical reaction, and some have put it in a number have put in their CV. So then you get to read about their whole career, and in a way, can be very useful way to research. Absolutely, yeah.
Why do you think it's important to retain this kind of material for the future?
Yeah, I think just to have materials at hand about people and their work and about artists is just so valuable, and about the galleries too, to be fair. Because then you get to see with the artists, you get to you can navigate their career, and you might find links within these files to other artists or art movements. Very much with the gallery files too, you'll see there are certain galleries that are very interested in particular types of art. Let me say that their way of doing business as well as a gallery. You get to see the kind of artists they're kind of engaged with and they're interested in. So to keep this stuff, the library is still collecting, and it's collected. The librarians and the volunteers who work on it all have an interest in art, who work on these files on an ongoing basis. So they're treated with a lot of respect. And I know that they're one of the most used collections, if not the most used specialist collection in the library. So yeah, I just think the AAA files and the gallery files are just an amazing resource. And if you've got any interest in Australian art, they're definitely a go-to for your research. Yeah, 100%.
Thank you, Alex. It's been so great to talk to you, as always. I always love our chats at the library. And great to learn more about the collection and your valuable work in preserving it and developing it. As you said, very often the materials that we find in the files might be the only remaining evidence of the work of a particular artist or a gallery or a group. And that's why projects like our memory bank are so important as well. So we're inviting the public to help us build an archive of this time for the future. So I'd encourage everyone listening to visit our website for further information about how to contribute. And please also join our Facebook group to engage with your fellow citizen collectors. Thank you.